Hey students, Miss Pavlicek here. I'm here today to bring you on your very own Tidepool field trip. I'm standing on an actual island in a park called Chandler Hovey Park. And this is in a town called Marblehead Neck, Massachusetts. And the island that I'm standing on is surrounded here by the beautiful water. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here in Chandler Hovey Park is there is a lighthouse. And the lighthouse is here to help guide the boats coming into shore in Marblehead Harbor. You're also going to notice that as we come down from the lighthouse and we pan, this is what we call a rocky shoreline. The rocky shoreline is where the water meets the earth or the land, and there are all these rocks. And as we pan out into the ocean here, you're going to notice some other land across the sea and some other small islands. But one of the things you will notice while we're standing here, again, is all this rocky shoreline. All right, well, here at the Tidepool field trip, we're going to talk a little bit about patterns and the patterns that we can observe or see on our Earth and in our world in nature. Now, here I have a model of our Earth, and here we are in North America. Now, a pattern that can be observed is that as the Earth spins or turns around, we call it rotates. That's one pattern that we observe. How long do you think that pattern takes for that Earth to rotate once completely around in a circle? That's right, it takes about 24 hours or 1 day. Now, as that pattern happens, we can observe another pattern that is called the tides. The tides are caused by the pull of the sun and the moon, what we call gravity. As the Earth rotates or spins, the gravity pulls at the water and causes the movement of the water to go toward the Earth's surface and away from the Earth's surface. There's some other patterns that happen here at the rocky shore. What happens is the water gets pulled from the ocean towards the rocky shore. And this happens twice during a day. Now, as that water gets pulled towards the shore, we call that high tide. And then a few hours later, the water gets pulled back off the shore, and we call that low tide. There are actually 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. Now, the reason why we call them tide pools is because as that pattern happens and the water comes up to the shore, it fills all the little rock crevices on the land in that rocky shore. And then as the water recedes or goes outward, those little pools or trapped water provides a great home and great habitat for lots of different living things. And we're going to learn and observe some of those living things that happen with the pattern of the tides. Are you ready to go explore the tide pools? Let's go! Okay, boys and girls, so here I am in the rocky tide pool on the shore, and we're gonna explore some of the living things or organisms here. Now, one of the things we'll be focusing on is their parts or their pieces and the function or the job that they do. And check out that lobster boat behind me, getting ready to catch some lobsters. Very cool. So let's meet some of the tide pool creatures and learn about their parts and function. One type of organism or living thing at the tide pool is called algae or seaweed. There are actually 3 different categories or groups of seaweed. There is red seaweed, brown seaweed, and green seaweed. Now, seaweed provides many things for the animals in their habitat here at the tide pool. It provides a food source, it provides shade from the sun, and it provides shelter from predators. The red algae tends to grow the deepest, and then we get to the brown algae, and then up near the shore is where we get the brighter green algae. Here we have a green algae or seaweed. This one is called sea lettuce because it looks similar to lettuce. Observe all these holes in the sea lettuce as it's an important food for many living things in the tide pools. Isn't it beautiful? This type of algae is some of the largest algae that we find here in New England. This is called kelp. And some of the kelps here can reach about 6 feet long. And in other areas of the world, they can be 30 or 40 feet long. And they provide a great habitat and food source and shade for the animals in the tide pool. Now, what's really neat is notice how the kelp has attached itself to the rock. It uses these little tiny fingers, and this is called a holdfast because it holds onto that rock. And kelp is so beautiful. It's also a good way to cool down on a hot summer day in the tide pool. This red algae covers the rocks at the lowest part of the tide pool. This is called Irish moss, or the scientific name is called Chondrus crispus. Now, Irish moss is special because a lot of the products that you use and you eat have Irish moss in them. How many of you guys brush your teeth? Yeah. Guess what's in your toothpaste? Irish moss. How many of you drink Nestle chocolate milk or Brigham's chocolate ice cream? Guess what you're eating? Irish moss. A lot of shampoos and conditioners. There is a gel or a thickener inside this algae that we use in all of those products. So next time you're at the rocky shore or in the tide pool, take a look out for red Irish moss. This type of algae grows on the rocks and is called knotted rack. Now, it's actually one type of algae with a second type of algae that grows in these little tufts. And it's called knotted rack because it looks just like when Miss P doesn't brush her hair and it's full of knots. Another great shelter and food source for the critters in the tide pool. This type of algae is called rockweed because it grows all over the rocks. What you'll notice is at the bottom of the rockweed are these bladders, and they're filled with a jelly-like substance, sometimes even air. And that helps allow the algae to float up to the surface when the tide pools are filled with water. Look, what is using this algae, this rockweed, as shelter. We have 2 different types of tide pool snails. Now, snails have a hard shell, which we call an exoskeleton. They do not have bones. There are 2 different kinds of snails. This one's eating the rockweed. This type of snail is called a periwinkle. It is small and black, and you can find hundreds or even thousands of them in the tide pool. The next type of snail we have is right here. This type of snail is called a whelk, and they are a little bit bigger and white. But look at its exoskeleton. If you also flip the snail upside down, you're going to see its suction cup-like foot. And it uses that to stick and hold itself onto the side of the rocks. And look, right next to this whelk is another living organism or critter called barnacles. Barnacles live attached to the rocks. If you look closely, you're going to see a little line. The barnacles are closed when there is no water in the tide pool. But as the water fills up, the barnacles will open up and they have these little fine filter-like fingers or hairs that come out to grab plankton and microscopic little animals from the water to eat as food. Barnacles can be very sharp. And here we have another animal with an exoskeleton. We have two little hermit crabs. Now, hermit crabs actually take up their home or their house inside the shells of periwinkles and other living things in the tide pool. Notice their long legs to help them move and get around, and they even have small antennae to help them feel around the tide pool and rocks and where they're moving. Now, when a hermit crab feels threatened or is nervous for Miss P picking it up, it can pull its body into that shell and stay protected. You might also see a little tiny pincher waiting to protect itself. Oh, and there he comes right out. Go, little hermit crab, go. And look at this hermit crab using its legs to climb up the tide pool rock surface. Whoop! Gonna try again, little buddy? And here we have a type of shrimp. The shrimp also has an exoskeleton. And look at that long antenna in front of the shrimp that it uses to census its way around the tide pools. Two large eyes and a fan-like tail that it uses to whip when it wants to swim. Let's see if we can get it to swim. Put this down. Let's see if we can get it to swim. Remember, being gentle and kind. Oh, nope, shrimp is frozen. Oh, there it goes. Let's see if we can do it again. Oh my gosh, so fast. Very good. Oh, there it goes. Awesome. And here we have Mr. Musselman's favorite tide pool creature. This is the mussel. It's actually called a blue mussel. Now, blue mussels also have a hard shell or exoskeleton, and they also open up to filter feed from other living things in the water. Now, the other neat part that they have is notice these little strings hanging off the bottom. These are called byssal threads or the mussel's beard. And these little strings act like fingers and attach the mussels to rocks or other things in the tide pool. What do you think, Mr. Musselman? High five? This living organism lives in the water in the tide pool. You're going to see that it has lots of little appendages that helps it to swim. This is called a scud or amphipod. The scud eat different types of algae and are scavengers at the bottom of the tide pools. They're kind of shrimp-like and look similar to a shrimp. Watch how it uses its little legs or appendages and even antennae to help it feel around in the container that it's in. And here we have just the exoskeleton or shell from another creature in the tide pool. This is the native rock crab. Native meaning that this crab lives here, normally in Massachusetts. You're going to notice the exoskeleton, which is hard and protects them. And the other part is their big pinchers. Those pinchers are there to break up their food and also to protect for anyone that might be curious. Ouch! Just kidding. Now, we didn't find any rock crabs today on our tide pool adventure, any living ones. And you want to know why? It's because of this crab. It's what's known as an invasive species. That means normally this type of crab does not live here on our shores. In fact, it's called the Japanese shore crab, which means it came from Japan. Different ships that travel in the water have a part of their boat called the ballast, where they get rid of extra water that helps balance the boat. Well, sometimes they illegally dump that water and little eggs from things like this Japanese shore crab make its way onto our shores. Now, the Japanese shore crab is a little more aggressive and breeds or reproduces a lot quicker than our native shore crabs here. So that is why when you come to the tide pool, you're going to see, lots of the Japanese shore crab. Look at those pinchers. Aren't they beautiful? You can also see the eyes and these long segmented legs to help them crawl along the rocky shore. You can also see their little feather-like mouth parts. These mouth parts are drawing in moisture that goes down to the gills, which normally takes in oxygen from the water to breathe. It's always important to be respectful and gentle to all living things in their habitats. And in fact, when we are done exploring and observing, we always remember to return our animals back to where they belong. And here we have another creature at the rocky shore near our tide pools. This is a type of seagull. And this seagull is kind of checking us out, and I guarantee was the one who ate that rock crab. Seagulls are not supposed to eat human food like you see people feeding them at the beach. It can actually make them very sick. It's more important to let these animals forage and hunt for their own food here at the tide pool. Crabs, mussels, and whatever else, they might find. And here, students, is a really neat find. These are very young sea urchins. They're a beautiful green and purple color. You're going to notice that their body is covered with lots of spines. These spines protect the sea urchin from being eaten from other living things. They also have tiny little tube feet on the bottom, which helps them move along the ground or the edge of the tide pool. You'll also notice in the center is their mouth. Their mouth has 5 teeth-like structures that is good for chewing things like crabs and other organisms in the tide pool. And here we have an even smaller one. Now, sea urchins are also eaten by human beings. It's known to be a delicacy. They'll cut around the mouth and pull that out and then eat the insides. Yum. Anyone here hungry for some sea urchin? Ooh, and here we have what's called a mermaid's purse. This is what a mermaid wears when it's traveling around throughout the ocean, visiting other ocean cities. Just kidding. This is actually another name for a skate's egg case. A skate is a fish that lives on the bottom of the ocean. and it lays this egg case with a baby inside. It uses these curly little fingers to hold on to seaweed and algae, and then the little baby hatches out the side of the egg case. Very cool mermaid's purse. One organism we weren't so lucky to find at the tide pool is the sea star. Now you might be thinking starfish, but this organism is not a fish at all. It is what we call an echinoderm. Now sea stars have 5 arms. At the end of each of their arms is an eye. They use this eye to sense light and shadows while in the tide pool. You're also going to notice that the body, the exoskeleton, is covered with tiny little bumps. This helps protects the sea star from other animals. Observe in the center of the sea star a little yellow dot. Sometimes they're orange. This is how the sea star draws in water to its body and moves it to other body parts, such as the underside of the sea star, which is covered with thousands or hundreds of tube-like feet. These little tube-like feet have suction cups on the bottom and allows the sea star to move around the tide pool surfaces and to hold on to different food or prey items like periwinkles or mussels. And their stomach and mouth are also on the underside of the sea star. That mouth is a circular section in the center, and they can actually push their stomachs outward to eat their food when they need to. Let's take a look at some of these interesting parts. Tube-like feet. What do you notice? Mouth parts eating periwinkles. Yummy! What do you notice about this sea star? That's right, it's missing some of its arms. But you'll also notice that it's starting to regrow some new arms. Sea stars are very fortunate because they can regenerate. This is when an animal loses a part of its body, and its body will make that new part so it can function and do what it's meant to do again. Very, very neat. Isn't nature amazing? This type of organism in the tide pool is called a scallop. A scallop belongs to a group of tide pool animals called mollusks. We met some other mollusks, things like blue mussels and periwinkles. Now, this type of mollusk is also called a bivalve. A bivalve meaning 2 pieces to their shell or their exoskeleton. What else do you notice about this scallop? What is attached to the top of it? That's right, it's the holdfast from a piece of kelp or algae. I was curious to see if the scallop was alive. I gently tried to pull apart the 2 pieces of shell, but I noticed I could not do it. So I decided to look in between them inside the scallop. And what I noticed were tiny little black dots and a fleshy body. Those black dots were all of their eyes looking at me. Hello, scallop. What are you looking at? It's just Miss Pavlicek admiring your beauty. This organism is called a sea squirt. This is another type of tide pool snail. It is called a limpet. Limpet snails have cone pointy-like shells that almost look like a little hat. They use their big suction-like foot to attach themselves to the rocks. They come in a variety of different colors. This is another example of an invasive species. This organism is called a colonial orange tunicate. It normally comes from the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Scientists believe that it is reproducing and growing here because of the rise in sea temperatures over the last 10 years. It almost looks like a sponge-like animal, but when looked at under a microscope, it is very different. These shells are from an animal called the slipper snail. When pulled apart, you can see that the shape of the snail's shell looks just like a slipper. It has a little platform with a crevice underneath. This little platform is there to help support the snail's body while inside the shell. Slipper shells will often layer on top of each other in order to help for reproduction. There'll be smaller males on top of the larger females, which allows them to mate easier. These snails can be found in a variety of different colors in the tide pools, and you can find their empty shells as well up on the beach. Unlike most organisms in the tide pool, this living thing is an animal that has a backbone or a vertebrate. This is a type of fish called a rock gunnel, and people often mistaken them, are they fast, as eels. You can notice that it does have some small fins near the front of its body, and it has a long tail that it moves and back and forth to help it swim. Very cool rock gunnel. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed visiting the tide pools here in Marblehead Neck in Marblehead, Massachusetts. One last thing that I found here in the tide pool happens to be this. This is trash. Boys and girls, a lot of times if we don't dispose of our trash and recycle the way we're supposed to, our trash ends up in places like our beautiful ocean, and it can harm sea creatures and other things here. Look at the size of this hook and this line. This could get tangled on a sea creature or even be harmful to their mouth or their throat. So please remember to recycle and throw your trash away and treat all living things with kindness and respect. I hope you enjoyed learning about parts and functions, and we'll see you again soon. Have a great day.